Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Carpet City Cinema, a Gila Films podcast. I'm David Weaver, and a really great week for Gila Films. We finally mailed the hard drive containing all the materials for The Last Frankenstein off to our distributor so that it can make its way onto Blu-ray and DVD. Did that late last week. Been in touch with the distributor, and as we get closer to knowing what a street date will be for the final product, then we can hand out more details about who is distributing it and some of the specs on the actual disc. I can tell you that it's going to have a couple different commentary tracks, the behind-the-scenes documentary that Jay put together, some deleted scenes. We'll have a full press release though once we get closer to the date. Though I don't have a specific date in mind for when it will be out. The distributor said that it wouldn't take long to put it together once it gets in his hands. So I'm hoping by sometime maybe late summer that'll finally be out. Just a great relief to finally get that off my chest, and has allowed me some more time to focus back on writing this week for the sequel screenplay. And so yeah, just rest assured that finally it's out of our hands. It's off to the distributor. It's that much closer to getting that movie out to people to have in physical form. But yeah, just focusing more now on the writing of the sequel so we can get that going. Had a really good night the other night with that. And just, of course, the research that's going into the script as well. So yeah, a very good, very productive week for Gila Films. And later this week, Jay, our fearless producer, is off to the Cinefest Film Festival, New York Cinefest, down in the Village in New York City for the screening of Break Glass, his film. He had a really good Q&A last week with the festival organizer that was posted up to Instagram. So if you get a chance to check that out, their handle is New York Cinefest, one word, over there on Instagram. So sad to see that we lost Harry Belafonte this past week, 96 years old. Of course, had an incredible life as a singer, an actor, and a civil rights and human rights activist. He was in one of the EGOTs, winner of an Emmy, a Grammy, an Oscar, and a Tony Award. His album, Calypso, was the first LP ever to sell 1 million copies. He was involved, of course, in many famous moments in the 60s civil rights movement, including organizing the 1963 Freedom March on D.C., and he was also one who participated in the Selma to Montgomery March down in Alabama. Just look at his film career. He was in, classics like the film noir Odds Against Tomorrow, the musical Carmen Jones, did a couple of films with Sidney Poitier, like Buck and the Preacher and Uptown Saturday Night, the post-apocalyptic racial drama The World, the Flesh, and the Devil, Robert Altman's Kansas City, just a ton of movies. And even a few years ago, I think it was like his first film in over a decade, he was cast in Spike Lee's Black Klansman. And he was given an Oscar for his humanitarian work, the Jean Herschel Humanitarian Award. His Tony came for his performance on stage in John Murray Anderson's Almanac. And back in the 60s, he appeared in a special, television special for Petula Clark, 1968. And they were doing a duet, and there was a moment there where she reached over and touched his forearm, and got some controversy, of course, back then, because it was like the first time, they think it might be the first time ever on primetime TV where a black man and a white woman were touching. But yeah, an incredible career, multifaceted career. Obviously, his daughters went on to become actresses. Sherry Belafonte starred on the TV show Hotel back in the early 80s. Of course, was also, for fans like me of cult cinema, in the movie Time Walker that Roger Corman was a producer on, and which was later riffed on Mystery Science Theater. His other daughter, Gina Belafonte, starred on the show The Commish, which my aunt's a big fan of. So, yeah, great legacy there, and definitely sorry to have lost him. Also, this past week, a couple people passed away with cult cinema connections. Um, the first of them is the Italian actor Giovanni Lombardo Radice, who often credited himself under a more anglicized name of John Morgan. He was in tons of cult films back in the 80s, and films like City of the Living Dead by Lucio Fulci. He was in Cannibal Apocalypse and Cannibal Ferox, House on the Edge of the Park, The Sect, and The Church. Also showed up in stuff outside the genre, like Scorsese's Gangs of New York and the acclaimed TV movie The Scarlet and the Black. And on the same day that he passed away, one of his co-stars from Cannibal Apocalypse also died, a Spanish actor, Ramiro Oliveros. And he was also a veteran of cult cinema. He was in films like The Swamp of the Ravens, Hundra, The Pajama Girl Case, Black Commando, which is a low-budget, modernized retelling of Othello. So yeah, two guys who not only were both veterans of the European genre films and who appeared together in the same film, Cannibal Apocalypse, but also passed away on the same day. So definitely sad to have lost them. Real quick, I just wanted to touch on something following up from last week's episode where we discussed the deadly trackers. One thing I talked about in that was the opening scenes to the film and how it was put out in still images with voiceover, and I kind of wondered if that was like, what was the motivation behind that? Was that intentional from the beginning? Was that something that just came about as a result of issues with footage? Why did they make that decision to do something like that, especially since it was really a very, in my opinion, poor way to start the film off? Seemed very clunky, very odd. And it's interesting because I was looking up images from the film just to have something to post on Facebook to go along with a social media post about the podcast episode. And I came across a behind the scenes production still, and it was Richard Harris with the director Barry Shear, and behind him, Richard Harris sitting in a wagon in like a carriage, is the actress who played his wife in the movie, Kelly Jean Peters. And this would be from the beginning of the film, during the moments in the film when the actions being depicted with still photos, because in those scenes we obviously don't see it happening because it's all still images, but they ride into town, Richard Harris and his wife, and we don't see her again in any actually moving footage until after the bank robbery started. But in this production still, she's holding a script, and to me, obviously, there had been, if they had intended all along to open up the film with just still photos, no one would, there would be no need for her to be looking at a script. She wouldn't really have any lines or anything like that. I don't think she'd really need to know what the action was if they were just taking still photos. So that tells me that they did shoot that opening footage, and that of the outlaws scoping out the town, of Richard Harris interacting with his son and his wife, which of course just begs the question all the more: why did they not use it? Because especially in a film, I mean, that film was shut down $1 million into the production because of problems with it, and we know that Rod Taylor and the director Barry Shear, they were brought in after the shutdown, after the project was revamped. So after you've already been willing to retool this project after $1 million investment, and you're willing to let go of most of the cast and so much of the crew, and the director, and with this new team in place, you then shoot an entire opening that you don't end up using. It just kind of seems strange. The only thing I can kind of think of off the top of my head, other than there just being a huge issue, maybe some huge technical issue with the footage. I mean, that's always possible, but it seems kind of strange that it would, those would be multiple shoots, because, the footage of Rod Taylor and the outlaws scoping out the town is separate from Richard Harris interacting with his family. So I don't think that, it seems unlikely that there would be an issue with all that footage. I'm wondering if they just came to the point where they wanted to keep the running time down, and they felt that they could do that opening quicker with still images than with actually depicting the scenes. I mean, the movie clocks in now at 110 minutes, so that's pretty close to 2 hours, obviously. And the shorter a film, the more times you get to play it in a theater in a day. So that's more money you can make. And they may have just been at this point realized we just need to get more screenings. They may have done the math and figured out keep it under 2 hours just with a bunch of still images at the beginning. But if we actually play it out as scenes with those kind of beats in between dialogue and any kind of lingering scenic shots, we just might find ourselves with a film that's clocking over 2 hours easily. Another 10, 15 minutes. And it's just not worth it at this point, especially after what we've put into it. So again, I don't know what happened to that footage, but it was really interesting to come across that picture just kind of randomly. So new announcements this week, new title announcements. Obviously, Severin's the big one this week. They just finally put out the details for their long-awaited box set of the Black Emanuel films. The box set's called The Sensual World of Black Emanuel. And if you're not familiar with this, Emanuel was a very popular, huge box office hit movie that came out in the mid-'70s, dealing with very erotic content. Not an adult film, but a film that could play in art houses. And so there was a decision to cash in on that success of that with a film called Black Emanuel, which starred Laura Gemser as this kind of globetrotting photojournalist who finds herself constantly getting caught up in exotic and erotic situations. And there just ended up being a series of these films throughout the years. And this set has a total of 24 movies on it. A couple of them are considered Black Emanuel adjacent movies. They're not part necessarily of the Black Emanuel canon, I believe, but they're kind of a similar in nature and origin. Also includes a documentary on Joe D'Amato, who was an exploitation filmmaker, very popular exploitation filmmaker, responsible for many of the Black Emanuel films. He also did the Ator films, which you might be familiar with from Mystery Science Theater 3000, because they were a series of Conan the Barbarian kind of rip-offs, and the second one, under its alternate title, Cave Dwellers, was riffed by MST3K. So yeah, it's a huge box set. It comes with music CD, comes with a book about the Black Emanuel films. It's also available in these amazing bundles they are offering with different merchandise, including this a board game they created for the movies, and also a replica airline bag like they used to use back in the days. I've never seen any of the Black Emanuel films, and I don't know that. This is kind of a set that I definitely would like to get at some point. It probably won't be as high a priority, compared to some of the other more expensive box sets out there. I'm still trying to acquire, especially from Severin. I still need to get their Gothic horror one, but it's definitely one that intrigues me, especially as I'm diving into Severin's podcast. They have a podcast where they talk about each month's releases, and I think that this is one I definitely want to pick up down the road. And it's a huge get, obviously, for fans of this series, fans of the sexploitation genre coming out of Europe in this time. Fans of Laura Gemser, the actress. And, just incredible the work they've put into this. This is a multi-year project they've been working on with all these, of course, with this many films, you'd expect that. And, just a huge testament, again, to Severin's devotion to cult cinema. I mean, obviously, before this, they had their Annie Milligan box set, their Ray Dennis Steckler box sets. I have both of those, as well as their folk horror set has that as well. So just, really glad to see them putting this out, even if it's not something that might quite hit the highest peaks of my interest. It's still definitely something I want to get down the road, and it's definitely glad they did it because these are films that definitely need that kind of attention given to them. And I think they definitely for the year so far are in contention for a release announcement of the year, if just not by sheer volume and dedication. So props to them for that for sure. Kind of a similar nature too, worth mentioning, even though it might not be something that I will, go for right away, is a couple weeks ago, Kino Lorber announced they were putting out on 3D Blu-ray the 1953 Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis movie Money from Home, and that this restoration will be by the 3D Film Archive, which is kind of like the definitive, entity for restoring 3D films. Um, Again, I'm not really. I love D. Martin by himself, and especially in conjunction with the Rat Pack. His stuff with Lewis doesn't really quite jive with me as much. But the really good thing about this is that this film was released on Blu-ray previously by Gila Films, and they just did a straight high def master, to, two-dimensional master of the film is what they used. And so now they're going to go back and do a 4K scan of the original negative and be able to release it on both 2D and 3D versions on the disc, which is a huge get because there are still quite a few 3D movies out there which haven't gotten 3D restorations, but that pool is definitely shrinking. And some of the ones that are kind of the outliers are owned by studios like Sony and Warner Brothers, and because of the way their approach or attitude towards licensing and towards in some cases making sure their restorations are done in house, um, some of those films are unlikely to see any type of 3D restoration anytime soon. And we're talking movies like Phantom of the Rue Morgue with Carl Malden, which was kind of Warner Brothers. One of the early follow-ups to their success with House of Wax. It also includes movies like Fort Ty, which I'm a big fan of. This French and Indian War movie with some crazy 3D scenes. So when you get to check another one off the list, and so that these films can be seen as they were originally screened in 3D, that's really great to hear. It's unfortunate that at least domestically, and it might be, I don't know if this is globally, but definitely domestically, they're not producing 3D televisions anymore. So you really have to kind of, I don't know if there's import options for the 3D TV. Some people just have to, you have to buy them kind of secondhand. And it's hopefully that there will be enough of a boost in this kind of content to at least see them manufactured again, even if it's just on some kind of limited boutique level, to kind of get those back to people's houses. Obviously, a lot of films have been post-converted into 3D. Like The Wizard of Oz is another example of that. And there's, newer films, which have come out in 3D. So it'd be great to kind of see that, get another chance, get a bit of a boost into the life for physical media, the 3D viewing, and especially in terms of getting the TVs manufactured again here. But yeah, kudos to them for making this happen, making this restoration happen. Again, not necessarily something I'll be jumping at, but really excited for the people who, want or very diehard fans of the 3D format, and also of course the Martin and Lewis fans. Can't forget them. So now on to the movie of the week, which I watched night before last. Pretty entertaining film from 1968, House of Cards. This movie was the third collaboration between leading man George Peppard and director John Gillerman. They had previously done the World War I aviation film, The Blue Max, and then followed that up with the private eye neo-noir PJ. And this would be the last of their collaborations. And in this film, Peppard stars as Reno Davis, who's an American over in France. He's kind of rootless. He's a boxer and a bit of a writer, who finds himself in between jobs and then gets hired by a wealthy woman whose husband was killed in military action in Algeria, and who's played by the lovely Inger Stevens. She hires Peppard to tutor her son and to come into the household she shares with her late husband's family. Well, it doesn't take long before things go awry. There's concerns on the behalf of Inger Stevens' character that her son is going to be kidnapped. There's accusations of her being mentally unfit, being levied at her by her husband's family. And eventually, Peppard realizes that underneath everything, there is actually a plot going on, a plot by a group of neo-fascists to overthrow the government and create a new world order. And this family is at the center of it, is at the center of this conspiracy. So yeah, if someone ever said to you, hey, do you want to watch that movie with George Peppard as a boxer who gets hired to be a tutor and then takes on a neo-fascist conspiracy? This is the one. This is that movie right here. This is kind of part of a wave of movies at Universal Pictures in the 60s that were definitely Hitchcockian in nature. I mean, Hitchcock made a lot of his product at this time at Universal Studios, including his TV show, many of the films he made. And in the wake of his success, you had movies come up like Charade and Arabesque and Blindfold. And they were definitely felt like Hitchcock movies not directed by Hitchcock. Now, you take something like Charade, and that's, in my opinion, equal to, if not better than, the best of Hitchcock's works. You know, the classic Cary Grant, Audrey Hepburn movie, directed by Stanley Donen. Phenomenal movie, great Henry Mancini score. I think, some of the ones that came after that, like Arabesque, which had Gregory Peck and Sophia Loren, also directed by Stanley Donen, as well as Blindfold with Rock Hudson. Not quite as successful, but still entertaining. They're have the lush Universal look of the time. I'd also throw in there something like Mirage, which is a film with Gregory Peck. Again, came out around the same time, a Universal film, black and white, but definitely still has kind of the same vibe as these other films. And House of Cards definitely falls into this group. It's bigger in scale, I'd say, in terms of the threat posed. You have this. I mean, in the prior films like Charade, the threat is criminals looking for missing money, whereas in this, it's a conspiracy that threatens to topple the government of an entire nation. So it's kind of like a little bit more. It's kind of like Charade on a James Bond scope, almost like, in terms of the threat that's posed. But it's definitely, like I said, definitely falls into that vein of films. This was based on a novel written by Stanley Ellen that was published in 1967. But Universal, before the book was even published, had acquired the rights to make this into a movie. And so they assembled, they got Peppard there and director John Gillerman. The original leading lady was different. It was Ava Renzi, who is probably known for films like Funeral in Berlin, which is one of the Harry Palmer movies starring Michael Caine. And then after this, she was in the classic, the Bird with the Crystal Plumage, that really kind of kicked off the entire Giallo wave. And then to write the script, they had on board the really famous husband and wife team of Irving Ravitch and Harriet Frank Jr. And Ravitch and Frank were, they're multiple Oscar nominees, known for their many collaborations with director Martin Ritt, including such movies as HUD, The Long Hot Summer, Norma Ray, Murphy's Romance. They also worked on films such as The Cowboys, The Reavers, The Dark at the Top of the Stairs. So at some point during production, after filming started, Renzi left the film. Now, there's different reasons if you kind of scope around as to why. One says that she was pregnant. Another says that she had a falling out with the director. And that's when Inger Stevens stepped into the role. Sadly, this would be Stevens' next to last feature film that was released before her untimely death in 1970 as a result of a suicide. A lovely, a beautiful, incredibly talented actress, born in Sweden. It came to America when she was about 10 years old. Known for films like Madigan, which is a really great Universal cop film with Henry Fonda and Richard Widmark. She was in A Guide for the Married Man with Walter Matthau, the comedy. Starred on the TV show The Farmer's Daughter, the TV version of that. Adapted from the classic romantic comedy that Loretta Young had starred in. And that was a role that won Stevens the Golden Globe and also earned her an Emmy nomination. And she's, really good in this. She's good in not just in terms of her acting, but just her presence, just her what she exudes. And I've kind of been on a George Peppard kick lately. I grew up watching Peppard on the A-Team, of course, in the mid '80s, back to back with Knight Rider, and always had that association in my head of him with the character of Hannibal Smith. And then, of course, you grow up and you realize, oh yeah, he was a big film star back in the '60s. Movies like Breakfast at Tiffany's and How the West Was Won, Operation Crossbow. I recently kind of had a run of his films I was checking out. I revisited Damnation Alley. I watched for the first time the cop movie Pendulum that he did the year after this one. I watched The Ground Star Conspiracy, which is a '70s movie. I've never seen that before. And then not too long ago, my girlfriend and I watched Banachek, his TV series from the '70s, also a part of the NBC mystery movie series. And, a lot of the stuff I've been watching with Peppard more recently, I kind of was left with the feeling that those roles weren't really either the roles weren't suited for him or his performances really weren't right. it just didn't really leave a great impression, as opposed to this, the sense of him I had had growing up as a kid in the role of Hannibal, which he fit so well into. And it was interesting to watch him in this film, in House of Cards, because it kind of like it was him fitting like back into a role like a glove, a hand into a glove again. It was definitely something that was really suited for his talents. It's kind of a light character he plays, a person who could be a man of action but also have a good quip. That's kind of what you think of with Hannibal Smith, and so it's kind of a forerunner to that character, you kind of say. As opposed to like something like Banachek, I enjoyed the Banachek show, and by no means is he bad in that show, but his character seemed kind of one note. He was always suave, smooth, kind of low, not very emotive, always had the upper hand. It was kind of like that all the time, without much variation. Even if you compare it to other characters that headlined some of the NBC shows, mystery shows at the time, like Stuart McMillan and McMillan and Wife, or Peter Falk's Columbo. And then films like I said, Pendulum and The Ground Star Conspiracy, which I had seen more recently, or even Damnation Alley, which is a film I enjoy a lot. It's a fun movie, but that's from taking a step back. Even though it's a fun movie, it's kind of a rough movie too. And Peppard's performance, definitely his accent, have leaves something to be desired. But even like I said, Pendulum and Ground Star Conspiracy, I don't feel like those parts and his talents as an actor really fit well together. So it was nice to see this movie and see him back in form and something that was really good for him. The film itself was really enjoyable. I enjoyed it. I had a good time. It was definitely, again, we talked about expectations before, how it's kind of hard to avoid that. You try not to have any when you go to see a movie. And I think my expectations were a little lower. And I guess I lost my faith, oh ye of little faith, when it came to late 60s Universal, which is my jam. I mean, I should have completely had faith in that. And it totally delivered. Is the film without its issues? God, no. The narrative, the development of the narrative is just problematic from beginning to end. There are so many plot developments, plot movements, plot happenings in this film that only happen by way of people doing stupid things that they would never do in real life. There are so many moments in this movie where a key action only occurs because someone engages in behavior which has you immediately going, why would they do that? That doesn't make any sense. But it's like that pretty much from the start, and it continues at such a consistent pace that you kind of eventually tune out to it. It becomes the film's spine, its skeleton. It's like, I mean, in reality, if this was going for any type of grounded sensibility, Peppard's character would have died pretty early on in this movie. The men behind this conspiracy would have just killed him, and would have, not only that, they would have. I mean, I don't want to get too spoiler heavy, but the challenges that they are presented with in this film, the challenges that this conspiracy has to go up against in the form of George Peppard and other characters in the movie who pose a threat to them. In real life, they just would have killed a bunch of these people who stood in their way very early on, very easily. And then the film would be about 5 seconds long. But again, like I said, this tendency of the film to just have nonsensical plot developments that defy logic and defy common sense just happen throughout the film. It's just becomes so consistent, and you just get used to it, and it just becomes the nature of the film. That's not an excuse for it now. I think that you still have a responsibility to do a better job of crafting your movie storyline so that things are believable and logical, because I don't think that this was like a stylistic design by any stretch of the imagination. I don't think they set out to make a movie where it's like, well, we're just going to have we're going to chuck believability out the window, and that's our style. That's what we're aiming for. No, I think that this was a byproduct of the production of the film. Interestingly, like I said, the screenplay is written by this very famous pair of screenwriters, but their name is not on the finished product. Now, if you watch the credits for the film, the screenplay is the credit for writing the screenplay is given to one James P. Bonner. And that is not a real person. That is a pseudonym standing in for both Ravitch and Frank. So I don't know why that is. I wasn't able to dig up anything on the film in terms of why they requested to have their names taken off. Um, and it is a pseudonym that it's not the only time they use that pseudonym. They used it later on in the Carrie treatment, the Blake Edwards movie, kind of neo-noirish medical mystery movie, which that's a good movie in terms of not just, the final product, but also, the actual screenplay. So I don't, maybe it kind of makes you wonder why did they change their name on this film, or did something happen to the screenplay? Maybe something happened on the Carrie treatment later too, and they didn't like that screenplay, even though I do. Um, but it's just interesting that this film definitely has uh, very noteworthy flaws of logic, despite being written by two very well-known, very well-regarded writers, and they had their name taken off. So I kind of wonder uh, how much can you really levy those problems at them versus maybe other hands that were kind of tinkering during the process. But yeah, like I said though, it has a pretty much right from the get go a great energy to it, a great vibe. It's about like an hour and 45 minutes long, but it constantly has things happening in it. Um, like I said, Peppard and is this is a role that's much better suited to his abilities. Stevens, very striking, a good fit for the role of the lead female. Orson Welles gets third billing, and he plays a newspaper publisher who's kind of the key figure behind this conspiracy. And he's basically he's his presence is relegated to two major scenes. He's in other scenes besides that as well, but there's I say like two kind of really key scenes that where he really is at the center of action, and he's great. He's really good in it. It was really great casting. He has a lot of just such a great presence, great delivery of the lines. He does little things with the way he puts forth the dialogue that he has. Definitely not. I mean, maybe he was phoning it in on his part. I don't know. It definitely does not come across like he's phoning in his performance. I mean, this was obviously, kind of in that point of his career where, he was, taking on roles like this, kind of like guest star roles in films to raise financing for his own projects. And even those were kind of becoming more sporadic. But he's really good in the film. He was very entertaining in especially those two scenes that he does have, those kind of two key scenes. Also, shout out to Keith Mitchell, who is an Australian-born actor who came to the UK in his mid-20s and became very highly regarded. He's really known for his many performances of King Henry VIII, who he played on television and in film. I know him because my girlfriend and I a couple years ago went through watching Murder She Wrote, and he is a recurring character in that show of a gentleman thief who reforms. He becomes an insurance investigator, and in this movie he plays Inger Stevens, a psychiatrist, and has a key part to a key connection to the plot mechanisms going on. Great voice, an actor with a great voice again, a great look to him. That was really good casting. And then in some smaller supporting roles, you had, and forgive me if I butchered their names, a couple striking European actresses. Perrette Pradier, who is became this really well-known voice artist. She plays a maid in the household of Inger Stevens's husband's family, who has kind of like a cheeky relationship with Peppard, and then Rosemary Dexter, who has a smaller part later on in the film as the daughter of one of the household employees. So yeah, definitely the cast is effective, and a really big shout out to the music score by Francis Lay, who a couple years after this would win the Oscar for Love Story. Really great tracks. The opening track is strong. And that's more lyrical, more easygoing. But then, as the action picks up and the tempo picks up later on in the film, he totally meets the moment with his music. It's and that's kind of like one of the things I remember, that you recall about Charade. Going back to that, the great Henry Mancini score, which was great in the action beats, and then also memorable in the the more romantic or dramatic beats. Again, I don't want to oversell anything here. This is not the reference point for 1960s suspense Hitchcockian uh, uh, genre filmmaking. Charade is definitely that. But this was, despite all its logical flaws, was just a really enjoyable film. I'm not sure really how it did upon its release. I found one contemporary review, actually a couple. I think I found from one from Variety, another one, I forget what the other publication was from, but they were basically kind of gave it kind of like lukewarm reviews. But financially, I don't really know how well it did. The interesting thing is it was an American production, um, but it wasn't released in America until 1969, almost a full year after it had debuted in Europe, which seems kind of strange to me. Seems like I'm not really sure why you would do that unless you lacked faith in the product, or maybe it was connected to some kind of production deal because they shot so much of it in Europe. But definitely interesting that it had that kind of year-long delay. I think also this is a movie where the mechanism of the ending wasn't quite as satisfying as you want it to be. It's not, again, not the ending itself, not in terms of how the plot um, is resolved, but just kind of like the mechanism by which they achieve that at the very, very end. Again, I can't really go into spoilers about it, but there's I wish they kind of promised something. They're kind of building up to something near the end, uh, involving the boy and the way that by which they plan to resolve the narrative, and then they kind of pull back on it at the last moment. Um, but why quibble? And again, I hate to kind of be so vague, but I don't want to ruin it for anyone. This film has had kind of a really rough release history in terms of physical media. There's clearance issues with it that kind of prevent it from having a U.S. release. I don't know what those are, but they've been around for a while because this film has never been released in America on Blu-ray. Prior to that, DVD. Prior to that, even VHS. If I'm not mistaken, it was released on Blu-ray in other territories, in France, and then in Australia by Imprint Films, who I've shouted out many times in the past, and that's where I got my release from. It's a nice Blu-ray with a slipcover. It comes with a historian commentary track, isolated score, which is nice, score and sound effects track. Um, Again, that does happen sometimes where a film's release is prevented due to a clearance issue, but it might only be in certain territories. And I don't know if that has something to do with the music score or the novel underlying the film. That could be it. Um, and sometimes the issue is just one of money, right? If you just pay enough money to whoever's kind of holding up the release, whether maybe it's the estate of the author of the original novel, or again, it could be something of a music nature, then that can resolve the issue. But it might just, in this case, it's a property perhaps that Universal doesn't feel it's worth that investment. Hopefully, at some point, it will kind of, get a domestic release, because that will kind of get a lot more eyes on this film. I'm sure Kino Lorber, this is something I could see them putting out in a heartbeat, especially since they have released so many of Peppard's films. Um, but yeah, I mean, if you're reaching free, totally import the Imprint Films Blu-ray, and to be aware that the reverse picture on this sleeve and some of the images in the still gallery were included from the wrong film. I opened it up and I see this image on the reverse of George Peppard lying with the actress Gail Honeycutt in a bed of money. And I'm like, wait a sec, this is PJ. And so PJ, the movie I mentioned before, the second of the collaborations between John Gillerman and George Peppard, that was also a Universal title. So somehow they accidentally pulled images from that for the reverse sleeve and a couple images in the still gallery. Not a deal breaker, obviously, but just giving you a heads up so you don't get confused. I remember when I was a kid, I got the VHS tape of The Invisible Man, the 1933 original classic with Claude Rains. Got it for Christmas, 1991. And I remember watching the movie, and then afterwards, which I loved still to this day, looking at the image on the back of the box and being like, I don't remember this scene in this movie. And it was a picture of the Invisible Man wrapped up in bandages and sunglasses, sitting at a table with a young man with a mustache, who I don't recall seeing in the film, and then a woman who is about the same age as the leading actress in The Invisible Man, and is a blonde, but her hairstyle looks different, and she doesn't look quite the same. And it wasn't I just was like, wow, I guess they deleted some scene or something. I was only a kid at the time, and of course realized later on that Universal, in creating the packaging, had accidentally put an image from the sequel, The Invisible Man Returns, on the back of the box. So yes, do not be confused why Gail Honeycutt is not in House of Cards, in case you watch this movie from the Imprint Films release. But yeah, I definitely recommend it. Again, don't want to oversell it. This is not the high point of what this type of film is. And there are definitely a lot of disconnected and loose strings um, in the film's plotting. But, when someone tells you the general idea of the film about, a neo-fascist organization trying to come to power and ex-boxer slash tutor George Peppard is there to take it on, you kind of might, right there, you're just kind of like, wait, what? That's what this film is about? I definitely would recommend, though, before you watch this film, is kind of, on some very basic level, familiarizing yourself with the Algerian War, the French Algerian War. Um, and that kind of brings up an interesting point I want to talk about, which is when you're making a movie and it's dealing with a historical event, to what degree do you need to give background on that event for the audience to understand? So, the French Algerian War, if you're not familiar with it, took place like the mid 50s to like the early 60s. It was basically Algeria, which had been taken over by the French way back in the day, fought for and won its independence. Initially, the French people were kind of more supportive of the French government maintaining control of the of this colony as they looked at it. Uh, but that support kind of started to fade away because some of the brutal measures that the French government, the military, was taking. And what happened was that there were people, of course, basically, like French people of direct French ancestry, who had to leave Algeria when it became gained its independence, and had to leave behind their some of their properties and businesses, and some of them returned back to France and were very resentful of this situation. And there was even a secret organization that formed, kind of head up by former military leaders, that even resorted to assassination attempts on the French president Charles de Gaulle, as a response to the loss of Algeria and the loss of what they had originally had under their control. So, in the context of this film, House of Cards, it's important to know about this because the family of Inger Stevens' husband, they are essentially exiles from Algeria. They talk about this in one of the first scenes where the family as a whole interacts with George Peppard. He comes to a dinner after being hired as the tutor, and they talk about how they are, they were colonials who lost everything they had in Algeria and are now, living in how sad living in their mansions in France instead of also having their mansions in Algeria, this colony. And there's references throughout the film as you find out more about this conspiracy, this plot. There are references to what had happened in the Algerian conflict without spelling it all out. There's references, for example, when Peppard uncovers the conspiracy, he's talking to one of the members of the family who's involved in it, and that family member is basically talking about how they lost what they had in Algeria. They lost their business and their land, and because they're frankly racist, they're upset that it was lost to people they consider savages. And Peppard reacts by basically saying, okay, yeah, your land deal went bad, you lost your real estate, and now you're responding by killing you know killing kids and trying to take out political leaders. And as they talk about this, they're referring to specific things that had happened during the French-Algerian conflict, but it's done in such a vague, kind of non-contextual way that you're kind of wondering, okay, is he referring to things that actually happened in real life in the conflict, real historical events, or is he talking about actions that we're supposed to assume this conspiracy engaged in? Now, if I had lived at the time that this was made, I'm sure that this, conflict would be much more present. This movie came out in 68. I believe the conflict ended in 62. So, it would be something that would be a lot more fresh in my mind. And, I'm sure I would understand a lot of the references. But as it is, even though I'm someone who I think, I have, I'm not like as much, say, a history buff as like my dad or my brother, but I still have by definition, an above average knowledge of history. And I don't mean that in any arrogant sense. I literally mean if you take the average knowledge of history that a person has, I'm technically above that. And I had heard, of course, I'd heard of the French-Algerian conflict. I was familiar, by name, but didn't really know anything about it beyond that. And this film, the driving force behind the psychology of these conspirators really requires a knowledge of what the French-Algerian conflict was all about, because they really don't, although they make references to it in the film, and they make references to the loss of land and, these kind of the racial tensions. It's never fully explained. It's kind of understood that you kind of already know what that conflict was about. Now, if this was a movie about World War II or the Holocaust, you think about events like that we're on this global scale that, this is what, 70 some years later. And, I would hope, most people know what World War II and the Holocaust was about. At the very least, they know that the Holocaust was this attempt to exterminate a certain group of people. And World War II was this global war that was, fought against Germany and Hitler's regime. And, you watch a movie now, whether it's made now or it was made in the past about World War II, they don't necessarily need to lay it all out about, okay, this is who the Nazis are, and this is what they believe, and they're led by a guy named Hitler, and they have this racist ideology. I mean, it's kind of, it's something that's permeated our cultural awareness so much that we know what that is. And again, 75 years later. And so whether you watch a movie, again, a World War II movie made at the time of World War II, or a movie made now, they don't necessarily need to give you, a play-by-play history on World War II to set you up and the rise of Nazism. But, and again, maybe this just speaks to my own ignorance. Totally willing to take that on the chin. But I feel like the French-Algerian conflict, although obviously very devastating, very important historically, very tragic, it never quite had the same cultural resonance that 20, 30, and now 45 years later after this movie was made, where you immediately know, okay, I know what they're talking about. I know what they're referring to. It was obviously a conflict that was a smaller scale. It was between two countries versus the entire world. It was, America wasn't directly involved in the way that, obviously not in the way that World War II. And at the time, they didn't feel the need to explain this kind of backstory, this context. But I feel like this is a movie that, you really do need to, if you were going to make a movie about the French-Algerian War now, unless maybe, and again, maybe this kind of speaks to if you were in France, if you're making a movie in France about the French-Algerian conflict, or you might not need to explain as much, but this is an American production. It's speaking to primarily an American audience. So, definitely I think a lot of what's going on and kind of like the historical context of this movie would be lost on the audience. They're kind of trying to be pieced together references to colonialism and, violence surrounding the Algerian Revolution and the loss of land. You might not totally be able to put together what exactly the picture is that's being painted of the historical context. So it just kind of something that I was thinking about, like, what do you need to do to set up, an understanding of history in a film that requires it in order to fully enjoy the plot, and maintaining a long-term view of that. Like, so when you're developing a script, constructing a movie, and you know that the audience has to be aware of and have an appreciation of some historical events in order to really grasp what's going on. How much do you feed to them about this back's history? And are you thinking in terms of people who are watching the movie now versus people who might be watching the movie 50 years from now. Especially if you're dealing with something that's rather contemporary. Like, for example, obviously right now we have the Ukraine conflict going on. Right now, everybody knows about Ukraine. Everybody knows that, on some basic level, that, Ukraine is a country in Eastern Europe, and Russia is trying to essentially, the Russian regime under Putin is trying to take it over. They might not, not everybody might not know the names of all the figures. They might not know as much about what's going on with the Belarusian people, but they have a sense. They know that, yes, Ukraine's on Eastern Europe. It's essentially an ally of the U.S. If you divide the world into good guys and bad guys, the U.S. is good guys, then you're going to put the Ukraine with them, and then Russia's the evil Russian Empire. And they have a sense that, you know what's going on. If you made a movie right now about Ukraine, you wouldn't the Ukrainian conflict, you wouldn't necessarily need to have as much backstory in it, because it's something that's so much in our conscience right now. But is the Ukrainian conflict going to be something, again, that has great cultural resonance 30 years from now? We don't know yet, obviously, the answer to that. And again, whether or not something has cultural resonance, by all means, has nothing to do, there's not necessarily a correlation between that and the seriousness of the event. In other words, obviously it's whether or not people remember the Ukrainian conflict 30 years from now is irrelevant in terms of, the tragedy of it and the loss of life that's happening. But from the perspective of art and making movies and writing books and whatnot, if you were to do something now, if you were to create a movie now or a TV show or whatever about the Ukrainian conflict, you'd have to think about that. Like, how much backstory do I need to give people? Do I need to give people more backstory than they really need, than many people might need right now? Because I don't know what people are going to know 30 years from now or 20 years from now. It's just an interesting dilemma. It's definitely something that has no one size fits all answer, right? It depends on the project. It depends on what you're dealing with. This is not like me trying to provide an answer to this question. It's just something more that kind of came to mind as I was watching the movie. Because I immediately, right as the movie was done, the first thing I did was jump online and quickly brushed up on like the French-Algerian war, because I was like, and of course it totally enriched, my understanding of what a lot of the film was about, and the fact that, like, and interestingly too, the fact that this kind of conspiracy being shown in the movie, like, I was laughing a little while ago because a boxer takes on neo-fascist conspiracy, George Peppard versus Orson Welles' a neo-fascist empire. It's funny, but it's also like at the same time, this was really happening too. There really was, conspiracies by members of or former members, I don't know if they're former or still current members of the French military, to kind of like, violently react to what they had perceived as a loss of something that was theirs. So it kind of, and again, you read this plot line to someone, and it does kind of sound far-fetched, and you're like, oh, this is going to be some kind of like, high escapism. But if you were watching this movie at the time, especially if you were someone in France, I can imagine this seemed a lot more realistic. It did not seem as ridiculous. So it's just interesting to kind of think about how the effectiveness of a story can depend on your audience's awareness of some real life, context. And what should you expect them to know? If you're going to write a story where their satisfaction with it, their ability to comprehend it is dependent on their knowledge of real life information, how much of that information should you assume they have? And really, again, like I said, it's not a right or wrong thing, because you could do whatever you want. You could have, as an artist, you could come in with the attitude that, like, well, I realize they might, they're aware, if you rank it or you kind of grade it, you might be like, all right, if they should be at a 100% knowledge level of this historical context, and in order to appreciate the film, and I know they're at like 60%, do I need to fill in that 40% gap? Your attitude might be like, well, screw that. They should, in order to understand this film, they need to be at a 100% level, and that's where they should be. It's not my problem if they're not at that level. It's not my problem if they don't, read up on what's going on in the world or read a newspaper or watch the news or be more finely tuned. I don't want to force feed the host to them. The film I want to make is, I'm not going to have all this expository dialogue and, heavy-handed background relaying. Um, they're just gonna either know what's going on or they're gonna be mystified. You could kind of come in with that attitude, or it doesn't obviously have to be something so antagonistic. You could approach a project just knowing that, like, okay, I want this film to unfold in this way, X, Y, and Z, and I understand that not everyone's going to fully reap the rewards of this plot because their knowledge of certain historical context, historical background isn't going to be even. But my goal as an artist is to tell a story in this way. So I understand the risks that come with that if people aren't as informed about this matter as I'd like them to be. And also, just kind of, spitballing here too, just the fact when I'm talking about giving people historical context, it doesn't have to be something heavy-handed like, you know, over the top exposition, 10-minute title cards rolling at the beginning of your film. It doesn't have to be anything heavy-handed like that. It really kind of drags. It's just, again, just talking about what when you're making a movie that requires this background knowledge, especially when you're making a movie that's dealing with something, whether that's something that's very fresh in people's minds now. And it doesn't have to be history, right? Like, it could be something completely, fictional. Like, you could be making the next Star Trek movie, right? You could be making the next Marvel movie, which obviously those things are not based on real life things, but there could be parts of those fictional universes that you kind of just, as you make your Marvel movie or you make your Star Wars movie, you're like, everybody knows about this. Everybody knows about who this character is because they've seen him in the other Star Wars movies, or they've seen this this weapon or the spaceship, or they know about the Force or whatever. They know about this alien race. You could kind of assume people take the same approach with something fictional like that, where you just you don't explain everything because you assume the audience is coming in with a knowledge of this fictional world. And could that come back to bite you? Could you have assumed too much, made too great of assumptions about what the audience knows, and that only becomes more obvious as time goes on. And I think you kind of especially see that in some of these, in terms of fictional content, completely fictional content, especially some of these universes become so sprawling, and now you come home from a Star Wars movie or a Star Trek movie or a Marvel movie, and there could be a key character who you think is fresh to the universe by way of this movie you just watched. Then you realize, oh no, this character was actually in an animated show, Star Wars show, 10 years ago. So again, what do you need to inform your audience about in terms of backstory? That's really what it comes down to. You're making a movie. Maybe it's based on real events. Maybe it's from some fictional world. But how much background information do you need to give to your audience? And if this film that you're making now, we'll use film as the example medium, if this film's background information is something that's very current, whether it's based on a real life event that's going on right now, like the Ukrainian conflict, or whether it's a property that's very hot right now, like Marvel is, right? Like Marvel's in Star Wars, they're very hot right now compared to where they were, 20 years ago or so. You think about Star Wars now versus Star Wars before the prequel trilogy, or Marvel now versus Marvel before the MCU movies. If your project requires background information and it's something that's very hot right now, how do you approach relaying this background information in the context of how hot this property is going to be in the future? What do you think about? How do you adjust the decisions you make about relaying information, knowing that things which might be shorthand for people now, things which you can just assume people will know as they watch the movie now, 15 years from now, they might not understand these references because either this intellectual property is not as popular or this historical event has, lost some of its global significance, whatever the reason being. How do you approach that as a storyteller? I mean, I kind of, even the last Frankenstein, there was a little bit of that because obviously, I'm pulling from this classic Frankenstein story. And I think everybody on some level, even if they haven't read the Frankenstein novel or seen some of the classic movies, people know that the general idea I think that so people carry with them about the story of Frankenstein is it's a guy, a scientist, uses dead body parts to bring, to create a living being, and it goes terribly wrong. And it just, it goes bad. I even, in my film, I didn't really feel the need, I never felt the need to kind of like go back and really kind of, just obviously the scene between Jason Frankenstein and Barb at the restaurant, but it wasn't like I needed to go do a play-by-play history on the entire Frankenstein family and be like, all right, there was the first Frankenstein guy lived in 1800 and something, and his name was such and such, and this is the experiment he did, and this is why he did it. I was able to kind of like, shorthand a lot of that because I just know that people are familiar with the Frankenstein story at this point. So yeah, something that even I've kind of, I didn't realize that, I was thinking about after watching House of Cards, I'm like, I actually did have to kind of deal with this kind of conundrum, in terms of dealing with the backstory of Frankenstein, and the fact that this entire universe of Frankenstein movies and TV shows and comic books and everything originates from Mary Shelley's one story written so long ago, and how much of that information does the audience need to have explained to them versus how much of it do they just, they know what Frankenstein means. It's something that kind of is taken on a bigger presence than what the original novel was. So anyways, these are just ruminations. These are just my random musings and ruminations on context and how much you need to give to your audience. Maybe I'm just talking to myself about this as I work on the next script. Who knows? But yes, House of Cards. A fun movie. Problematic with the plot. But hey, had fun watching it. Good music score. Enjoyed the cast. Loved Orson Welles in it. And definitely recommend it. Get a region-free player, import one of the Blu-rays, and have fun with it. It's a good time. All right, so that's going to do it for now for this episode of Carpet City Cinema. Thank you very much for tuning in. Continue to spread the word. Follow us on Facebook through the Carpet City Cinema Facebook page. Also, our various handles on Instagram and Twitter, which are devoted to Gila Films. Definitely share the word about the podcast and get people to like it. Click that like button on the Facebook page, on the YouTube videos. Definitely just trying to drive more awareness of the Gila Films brand and the different projects we have going on. All right, everybody, have a good night, and see you next week.